So far, we've talked about the two extremes of competition. We've talked about perfect competition, that is as competitive as you can possibly get, and we've talked about monopoly, which is as uncompetitive as you can get. We also talked about why perfect was perfect. We talked about how it was allocatively efficient in the long run, and in the long run they produce efficient scale, and there were no economic rents, no excess profits to be earned. There's also no markups. But for a monopoly, it was the opposite, right? You have the ability to charge to earn economic rents. You can charge a markup where your price is more than your marginal cost. It's allocatively inefficient, and it is not producing at the efficient scale in the long run. Okay? So that's the bad news. The good news is that neither of these are particularly common. Right? These are the two extremes of competition, and the real world, like in most cases, lies somewhere in this gray area in between. So in these series of videos, we're going to talk about what lies in between. And there are two forms of imperfect competition that we're going to talk about. One is called monopolistic competition. And then the other form of imperfect competition is called oligopoly. So these are our two imperfectly competitive forms. Now, before we go into those two imperfectly competitive types of firms, let's recap the characteristics of each of our two extremes. So perfect competition had many firms, so many sellers. It turns out we also assume that there are many buyers too. So many sellers, many buyers, all selling identical or homogeneous goods, and then there were no barriers to entry. For a monopolist, we have one seller. We're assuming though that there are many buyers. And we talked a little bit about the special case where that's called a monopsony. Monopsony is one buyer, many sellers. And that might seem like that's a pretty funky market. It turns out a lot of labor markets are like that, especially if you think about a labor market in a very small town where there is really only one employer. Then there's only one buyer of labor, that one employer, but lots of people trying to sell their labor. If you think about in high school when you learned about coal towns where the coal company basically owned everything, that's another example of a monopsony market. There's some healthcare markets that are also monopsony markets, particularly when you have insurers, when you have basically one firm that's paying for healthcare, but many healthcare providers who are the sellers of a good. So going back to a monopoly, we have one seller but many buyers. They are selling a homogeneous good because it's the only good being sold, but there are barriers to entry. Now, if we think back to our perfectly competitive firm, these two things were the reason why the firm had no control over price. So they had many buyers, many sellers, also that they were selling the identical good, the homogeneous good, that firms in this market had no control over price. On the other hand, in the monopoly market, one seller selling just one kind of good meant that they had control over price. And then with the barriers to entry, that no barriers to entry led to the outcome that you have no economic profit in the long run, but because there were barriers to entry in a monopoly, you do have economic profits in the long run. So we're going to use these conclusions that we got from these assumptions or these characteristics to maybe predict what some of the outcomes are going to be in each of these other types of competitive industries. So let's start with monopolistic competition. This is a market where you have many sellers and many buyers. Right? So far, sounds a lot like perfect competition. That's where the competition part of that comes in. What makes this type of a firm different is that they have slightly differentiated goods. So they're not selling identical goods, they're somewhat heterogeneous goods. So if you think about the market for hamburgers, fast food hamburgers, a Wendy's hamburger is slightly different from a McDonald's hamburger, is slightly different from a Rally burger, etc. Okay, so even though we're in the market for fast food hamburgers, each of our many sellers out there are selling a good that's slightly differentiated. And this means that they will have, just like a monopoly, they have a downward sloping demand curve. So they do have some price control. Maybe not as much as a monopolist, not as much as they would like, but they do have some control over price. Now, a downward sloping demand curve is also why you ended up with deadweight loss. Remember that downward sloping demand curve is what led to marginal cost and your demand curve not equaling to each other. So our monopolistically competitive firm is going to be similar to a monopoly in that this type of firm also experiences deadweight loss. Now, in another way that it's like competition, a monopolistically competitive firm has relatively no barriers to entry, or at least the barriers to entry are very, very low. So what does it take to get into the hamburger business? Right? Rent a food truck, right? It doesn't take very much to enter this market. Now remember, this is what led to there being no economic profits in the long run. You've probably heard the saying that the restaurant business is notoriously difficult to do well in, and that's a big part of it. And if you think about how many restaurants are out there, there are a lot of sellers, and they all have slightly different stuff, but a lot of them go out of business all the time because they're not earning economic profits. So you'll have no economic profits in this kind of industry in the long run. So in a way, this is going to be like the worst of all worlds. Okay? We're going to end up with inefficiency. We're going to end up with no economic profits. So it's bad for buyers, bad for the sellers. So why is it the most common type of industry? Well, a big part of that is because of this, right? We like the fact that we can get different kinds of hamburgers. We would not be happy if our only choice was only one kind of burger. So we put up with some of these inefficiencies because we like some product variety. Now let's talk about oligopoly, the one with the funny name. Now this one's kind of, it's going to sound very fuzzy and very ill-defined, but bear with me for a moment on that. It can have few sellers. Usually we think of many buyers, but it could actually have few buyers as well. So what do we mean by a few? We mean more than one and less than many. And if you think that's a wide variety, you're correct. That means the smallest size of a monopoly is 2 firms. And we call a 2-firm monopoly a duopoly. Oops, duopoly. So you have a few sellers, many buyers selling a good that might be, so it may be homogeneous or heterogeneous. Right? It could be It could be identical like in a perfect competition, but it could be slightly differentiated as well. What is different about an oligopoly, though, is that there tend to be more barriers to entry. Now, oligopoly is going to be our one exception of a firm or industry that we do not graph. We could graph it if we wanted to, but the graph is really complicated, and we're going to leave that for when you go and do your MBA. Instead, to figure out what results we will have in an oligopoly market, we're going to revert to game theory, but we're going to talk more about that later. So these are 4 general types of firms, our characteristics of each of these types of firms, and some conclusions about some of those outcomes. Now, let's think about the conclusion of an outcome in an oligopoly market. They're barriers to entry. What other type of firm had barriers to entry? Monopoly. And that is why we might have economic profits in this market.